the grand ballroom of the prestigious Beverly Hills auction house, the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the towering windows, illuminating a simple glass display case that had drawn crowds all morning. Inside, resting on a bed of burgundy velvet, sat a pair of well-worn leather boots that had walked through American history. These weren't just any boots. They were John Wayne's personal riding boots, worn throughout his legendary career in Western films. The boots bore the marks of countless rides across movie sets, their leather creased and weathered by decades of use. Each scuff and scratch told a story, from the dusty trails of true grit to the rugged terrain of the cowboys. The worn soles spoke of a man who stood tall in American cinema, while the carefully preserved leather reflected the care of someone who understood the value of hard work and craftsmanship. As visitors gathered around the display, whispers filled the air about the upcoming auction. These boots, expected to fetch hundreds of thousands of dollars, represented more than just movie memorabilia. They symbolized an era of American filmmaking when heroes were larger than life, and values like courage, integrity, and determination shaped the stories that captured the nation's imagination. The auction house staff had been preparing for this moment for weeks. The boots' provenance was impeccable, documented with photographs, letters, and testimonials from those who had worked alongside the Duke himself. Each piece of evidence added another layer to the story of these remarkable artifacts, drawing collectors and historians from across the country. Among the growing crowd, some reached out to touch the glass, leaving fingerprints that the staff quietly wiped away throughout the day. Others stood back, arms crossed, nodding appreciatively as they discussed the historical significance of the piece. The older visitors shared memories of watching John Wayne's films in theaters, while younger ones listened intently, beginning to understand why these seemingly simple boots had caused such a stir. The auction catalog described them in detail: size 11 custom-made riding boots, crafted by the legendary Hollywood bootmaker To the Stars, worn by John Wayne in over a dozen films between 1957 and 1973. But what the catalog couldn't capture was the presence these boots still commanded, how they seemed to carry the spirit of the man who wore them, standing as a testament to an age when Hollywood created not just entertainment, but lasting symbols of American values. Security guards maintained a watchful eye over the display, occasionally sharing snippets of information with curious onlookers. They'd seen plenty of valuable items come through these halls, but there was something different about these boots. Perhaps it was how they brought people together, sparking conversations between strangers about favorite films, cherished memories, and the values that John Wayne represented both on and off the screen. As the afternoon wore on, the auction house began its final preparations. Staff members checked the lighting, adjusted the microphones, and reviewed the seating arrangements for the high-profile guests expected to attend. The auction catalog's estimate suggested a starting bid of $50,000, but many suspected the final price would far exceed that figure. Yet somehow, the monetary value seemed secondary to the historical and cultural significance these boots represented. The air grew thick with anticipation as the hour of the auction approached. Potential buyers began arriving early, taking their places in the plush seats arranged before the auctioneer's podium. Each had their own reason for being there. Some sought to add to their collections, others hoped to preserve a piece of cinema history, and a few simply wanted to witness the moment these iconic boots would find a new home. Little did anyone know that this auction would become memorable, not for the final price these boots would command, but for an unexpected encounter that would remind everyone present about the true value of heritage, respect, and understanding. As the crowd continued to gather, the stage was being set for a moment that would leave an indelible mark on all who witnessed it. The quiet murmur of the auction house was interrupted by the distinctive sound of Italian leather shoes clicking against marble floors. Marcus Thompson made his entrance in a way that demanded attention, though not for the reasons he might have hoped. The 35-year-old tech billionaire, dressed in a custom-tailored Brioni suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary, moved through the crowd with the kind of confidence that comes from having more money than respect for history. His presence was announced not just by his appearance, but by the small entourage that followed him: personal assistants tapping away at tablets, a private art consultant speaking in hushed tones about potential acquisitions, and a security detail that seemed more for show than necessity. Marcus had made his fortune developing a social media platform that had changed the way people communicated, though some would argue not necessarily for the better. The young billionaire's reputation preceded him. Known for his collection of modern art and his dismissive attitude toward anything he considered outdated, Marcus had been featured in countless tech magazines and business publications. His Malibu mansion housed an impressive array of contemporary artwork, but notably lacked any connection to traditional American culture or history. As he approached the display case containing John Wayne's boots, Marcus adjusted his designer glasses with manicured fingers. His watch, a limited edition timepiece worth more than a suburban home, caught the afternoon light and scattered it across the glass display. The contrast between the pristine, modern luxury he wore and the worn historical boots before him couldn't have been more stark. His art consultant, sensing an opportunity to share her knowledge, began to explain the historical significance of the boots, but Marcus cut her off with a wave of his hand. He had no interest in what he considered relics of a bygone era. To him, success was measured in stock prices and social media followers, not in the preserved artifacts of old Hollywood cowboys. The way Marcus carried himself spoke of someone who had achieved enormous success at a young age, but had perhaps missed some essential lessons along the way. His posture was perfect, trained by expensive personal trainers, but lacked the natural dignity that comes from earning one's place in the world through hard work and perseverance. His smile, practiced for countless photo opportunities, never quite reached his eyes. As he circled the display case, Marcus's designer shoes created a sharp contrast with the worn leather of the boots inside. Each step he took seemed to emphasize the distance between his world of digital innovation and the authentic, tangible history before him. His presence had begun to draw attention from other auction attendees, though not for the reasons he was accustomed to. The tech billionaire's demeanor shifted as he noticed people watching him. He stood straighter, adjusted his jacket, and adopted the air of someone who believed they were about to educate everyone present on the true nature of value. His fingers drummed against his phone, the latest model not yet available to the public, as he prepared to share his opinions with anyone within earshot. What Marcus failed to notice, as he positioned himself prominently near the display, was how his very presence seemed to create a divide in the room. On one side stood his world of instant gratification and digital wealth. On the other, the gathered collectors and historians who understood the priceless nature of heritage and tradition. The stage was set for a collision of values that would shake both worlds. The afternoon sun continued to stream through the windows, casting Marcus's shadow across the display case containing John Wayne's boots. In that moment, as he prepared to speak, no one could have predicted how the next few minutes would unfold, or how a simple pair of worn leather boots would become the catalyst for a lesson in humility that would resonate far beyond the walls of the auction house. Marcus's laughter cut through the respectful atmosphere of the auction house like a knife through silk. Standing before John Wayne's boots, he made no attempt to hide his disdain as he spoke loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Can you believe people actually want to bid on these old things?" he asked, his voice dripping with mockery. "They look like something you'd find in a thrift store bin." The crowd around him grew silent, the kind of silence that falls heavy with disapproval. But Marcus, either oblivious or indifferent to the reaction, continued his performance. He pulled out his phone, holding it up to take a photo of the display case. "This is hilarious. Wait until my followers see what people are willing to waste their money on. Old, beaten-up boots from some cowboy movies?" His words echoed through the space, each syllable seeming to bounce off the carefully curated displays of historical artifacts. Several elderly gentlemen in the crowd exchanged glances of quiet indignation, while a group of museum curators whispered among themselves, their faces tight with controlled anger. "Look at these scuff marks," Marcus continued, pointing at the glass with his manicured finger. "They're calling this patina in the catalog. Where I come from, we call that worn out." His entourage offered polite, uncomfortable laughs, caught between their employer's behavior and their own sense of propriety. A small crowd had gathered now, drawn not by admiration, but by the spectacle of Marcus's disrespect. His art consultant made a weak attempt to interject, "Mr. Thompson, these boots actually have significant historical value." But Marcus waved her off again, his attention fixed on composing the perfect social media post to mock the auction item. Historical value, he scoffed, typing on his phone. I could buy 1,000 new boots with better craftsmanship. This is just people getting sentimental over old things because they're afraid of progress. In Silicon Valley, we understand that value comes from innovation, not preservation. The tension in the room continued to build as Marcus circled the display case like a prosecutor building a case. What's next? Are we going to start auctioning off old sandwich wrappers because some famous person might have touched them? His laugh was sharp and hollow, echoing off the high ceilings. Several auction house staff members had noticed the commotion, but seemed unsure how to handle someone of Marcus's status and wealth. They hovered at the edges of the growing crowd, exchanging uncertain glances as the tech billionaire continued his performance. You know what's really funny? Marcus asked no one in particular, still focused on his phone. These probably aren't even the real boots. Hollywood probably had dozens of pairs. This whole thing is probably just marketing to get people to spend money on nostalgia. The murmurs of displeasure from the crowd grew louder, but Marcus remained ensconced in his bubble of perceived superiority. He gestured to one of his assistants. Make a note to look into creating a digital NFT of these boots. At least that would have some actual value in today's world. Just then, an elderly woman near the front of the crowd spoke up, her voice quiet but clear. Young man, some things have value beyond their price tag. But Marcus either didn't hear her or chose to ignore her, continuing his monologue about the superiority of modern technology over historical artifacts. The afternoon sun had shifted now, casting long shadows across the auction house floor. In the changing light, Marcus's expensive suit seemed somehow less impressive, while the worn leather of John Wayne's boots took on an almost ethereal glow in their display case. As Marcus prepared to take another photo, his phone suddenly sparked with notifications. See? He said triumphantly. My followers are already agreeing with me. This is what real influence looks like, not some old boots from ancient movies. The crowd had grown larger still, their collective disapproval palpable in the air. Among them, though not yet noticed by Marcus, stood a figure whose presence would soon transform this moment of disrespect into something none of the observers would ever forget. At the edge of the agitated crowd, James Cooper stood quietly, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. At 75 years old, he cut a striking figure despite his age, tall and straight-backed, with the kind of dignity that comes from a lifetime of honest work and genuine purpose. His clothes were simple but clean, a pressed Western shirt, well-worn jeans, and a pair of boots that had seen their fair share of ranch work. James had been watching Marcus's display of disrespect with growing concern, not for the insults being hurled at the boots, but for what those words revealed about the young man speaking them. His clear blue eyes, still sharp despite his years, took in every detail of the scene. The way Marcus's entourage shifted uncomfortably, the rising tension in the crowd, and most importantly, the disconnect between the tech billionaire's wealth and his understanding of true value. As a former ranch hand who had worked alongside John Wayne on several film sets, James carried memories that no amount of money could buy. He remembered the Duke not as the larger-than-life figure from the silver screen, but as a man who treated everyone, from directors to stable boys, with the same genuine respect. Those boots in the display case weren't just movie props to James, they were symbols of an era when a handshake meant something, and a person's character mattered more than their bank account. James began moving through the crowd with the unhurried confidence of someone who had nothing to prove. People seemed to naturally step aside for him, sensing perhaps that they were witnessing the entrance of someone significant, though they couldn't have known exactly why. His boots made a soft, steady sound against the marble floor, a rhythmic counterpoint to Marcus's continuing monologue. The veteran's face bore the marks of years spent under the southwestern sun, each line telling its own story of cattle drives, movie sets, and quiet moments of contemplation under star-filled skies. His hands, rough from decades of honest work, were steady as he made his way closer to the display case where Marcus continued his performance. Several of the older auction attendees recognized James, having seen him in behind-the-scenes photographs with John Wayne. Whispers began to circulate through the crowd about who he was and his connection to the boots that had become the center of such controversy. But James paid no attention to the murmurs. His focus remained on the young billionaire who was still tapping away at his phone, oblivious to the approaching storm. The afternoon light streaming through the auction house windows caught the silver in James's hair, creating what almost looked like a halo effect. It was the kind of moment that, had it been in one of the Duke's movies, would have signaled to the audience that something significant was about to happen. The tension in the room seemed to shift, moving from indignation to anticipation. James paused for a moment, about 15 feet from Marcus, and studied the young man with the kind of patience that only comes with age and experience. He saw beyond the expensive suit and carefully cultivated image to something else, something that reminded him of other young men he'd known over the years who had confused wealth with worth. The contrast between the two men could not have been more striking. Marcus, with his designer clothes and technological trappings, represented a world of digital wealth and instant gratification. James, in his simple Western wear and quiet dignity, embodied the values of a generation that understood the worth of things that couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. As James took his final steps toward Marcus, the crowd fell completely silent. Even Marcus's entourage sensed the change in the atmosphere, their nervous shuffling coming to a stop as they watched the elderly man approach. The only sound was the soft clink of James's spurs. Real, working spurs, not decorative ones, as he moved closer to the display case. The moment hung suspended in the air, like the pause before a summer storm. James Cooper, veteran, ranch hand, and keeper of memories that stretched back to Hollywood's golden age, was about to teach a lesson that no amount of money could buy. And Marcus Thompson, still absorbed in his digital world, had no idea that his life was about to change forever. "Yo, those boots," James began, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of decades of experience, "walked through more history than your social media posts will ever capture." The words, spoken with a gentle southwestern drawl, cut through Marcus's laughter like a knife through butter. The tech billionaire turned, startled by the interruption to his performance. James stood just a few feet away now, his presence commanding attention without demanding it. "I was there when the Duke wore those boots on the set of The Cowboys, watched him break them in himself, refusing to let anyone else do it because he believed that a man's boots should tell his own story." He took another step forward, his own boots making a soft sound against the marble floor. Marcus's initial surprise quickly transformed into his usual practiced condescension. "Look, old-timer," he started, but James raised a weathered hand, silencing him with the kind of authority that comes from experience rather than wealth. "Son, I've been listening to you mock something you don't understand, and it reminds me of what John Wayne once told a young actor who was showing off his expensive new costume." James's eyes never left Marcus's face as he continued. He said, "It's not the clothes that make the man, but the man that makes the clothes." The crowd had drawn closer now, forming a tight circle around the two men. Marcus's entourage had backed away slightly, sensing that their usual tactics of interference wouldn't work in this situation. The tech billionaire's phone hung forgotten in his hand, his social media post left unfinished. "Those scuff marks you were laughing about?" James gestured toward the display case. "That one there, on the left boot? That happened when John visited a children's hospital in '69. Spent so many hours walking through those halls, talking to sick kids, that the leather wore down. Never complained once about his feet hurting." Marcus shifted uncomfortably, his expensive Italian shoes suddenly feeling somewhat less significant. "That's a nice story." He attempted to regain his footing. "But in today's world..." "In today's world," James interrupted firmly, "we need reminders of what real value looks like more than ever. See that crack in the right heel? That's from when he stood for 6 hours at a veteran's benefit, refusing to sit down because he said if the soldiers could stand in battle, he could stand for them." The auction house had grown so quiet that the sound of traffic outside seemed to fade away. Even the staff had stopped their preparations to listen. James reached out and placed a hand on the glass display case, his reflection overlaying the boots within. "I'm not here to shame you, son." James's voice softened slightly. "I'm here because when I look at these boots, I see more than just old leather and worn soles. I see the story of a man who understood that his real worth wasn't in what he owned, but in what he gave back to others." Marcus swallowed hard, his earlier bravado diminishing under James's steady gaze. "How do you know all this?" he managed to ask, his voice lacking its previous certainty. "Because I was there," James replied simply. "I worked as a ranch hand on his films, but more importantly, I watched him live the values these boots represent. Every scuff, every crack, every worn spot tells a story of service, of humility, of understanding that true greatness isn't about what you take from the world, but what you give back to it." The tech billionaire's face had lost its mocking smile, replaced by something that looked almost like shame. His phone had disappeared into his pocket, his social media post forgotten. Around them, the crowd stood in respectful silence, witnessing a moment of genuine connection between two very different generations. "Those boots," James concluded, his voice carrying to every corner of the now silent auction house, "might not have any value in your digital world, but they carry something more precious than any algorithm can measure. They carry the footsteps of a man who understood that real wealth isn't counted in dollars, but in the lives you touch and the legacy you leave behind." James turned back to the display case, his reflection merging with the worn leather of the boots behind the glass. "Each mark on these boots tells a story," he began, his voice taking on the cadence of a natural storyteller. "Not just about movies, but about moments that shaped lives and touched hearts. This scrape here," he pointed to a distinct mark on the right boot, "happened during the filming of True Grit. The Duke insisted on doing his own stunts that day, saying a man should never ask others to take risks he wouldn't take himself. Took a fall on some rocks, scraped these boots something fierce, but got right back up and finished the scene." Marcus found himself drawing closer to the display case, his earlier disdain replaced by a reluctant curiosity. James continued, "But the real stories, the ones that matter most, happened off the set. See this worn patch on the sole? That's from a Christmas Eve in '71 when John spent hours walking through a VA hospital. Refused to use a wheelchair or take breaks, said he wanted to reach every room, every veteran." The tech billionaire's entourage had fallen completely silent, their tablets and phones forgotten as James painted pictures with his words. "These boots walked through dust storms and rain, through hospital corridors and charity events. They carried a man who understood that fame was a responsibility, not a privilege." One time, James's voice grew softer, compelling everyone to lean in closer. "We were filming near a small town in Arizona. Local rancher's barn had burned down. The Duke showed up in these boots, spent 3 days helping rebuild, never called the press, never wanted recognition, just said a man's got to help his neighbors." Marcus's expression had transformed from skepticism to genuine attention. James noticed and gave a slight nod of acknowledgement before continuing, "That discoloration near the heel? That's from standing in floodwater, helping sandbag a community center in '72. The studio wanted him to leave, had a big shoot scheduled the next day. He just said, 'The movie can wait. These folks can't.'" The afternoon light streaming through the windows had taken on a golden quality, seeming to illuminate the boots in their case with an almost reverent glow. "Every scratch, every scuff, every worn spot tells a story of service," James explained. "Not the kind that gets headlines or trends on social media, but the kind that changes lives one moment at a time." He turned to face Marcus directly. "These boots walked through movie sets, yes. But they also walked through children's hospitals, veterans' homes, and disaster areas. They carried a man who understood that real strength isn't shown in how much you can take, but in how much you can give." "There was this one day," James continued, his eyes distant with memory, "when we were filming in Texas. Hot as blazes, everyone exhausted. The Duke noticed one of the younger crew members looking particularly worn out. Without a word, he sat down next to that boy, took off these very boots, and gave them to him to use while his own were being repaired. Walked around in his socks for hours, didn't complain once." The tech billionaire's phone remained untouched in his pocket as James shared story after story. Each tale revealed not just the history of the boots, but the character of the man who wore them. "That crack in the leather there? From kneeling down to talk to a child in a wheelchair, spent an hour at that child's eye level, treating him with the same respect he'd give to any studio executive." James reached out and placed his hand against the glass once more. "These boots weren't just costume pieces. They were tools of service, markers of compassion, symbols of a time when a man's word was his bond and his actions spoke louder than any words could. The auction house had grown so quiet that the sound of traffic outside seemed to have faded away entirely. Even the staff had stopped their preparations, caught up in the oral history being shared. Marcus stood transfixed, his earlier mockery forgotten as he began to see the boots through new eyes. "You see, son," James concluded, his voice gentle but firm, "these boots might look worn and old to modern eyes, but every mark on them is a medal of honor, every scratch a testament to character, every worn spot a badge of service. That's the kind of value you can't measure in dollars or followers. What makes a thing valuable?" James asked, not expecting an answer as he continued to gaze at the boots. Is it the price tag, the brand name, or is it something deeper, something that speaks to who we are and what we stand for? His weathered hand remained on the glass, a physical connection to the history within. "These boots," he continued, "represent something we're in danger of losing in today's world. The understanding that true worth isn't measured in dollars or social media likes, but in the impact we have on others' lives." James turned to face Marcus, whose usual confident demeanor had been replaced by quiet attentiveness. When John wore these boots, he lived by a code that seems almost foreign today. Integrity wasn't just a buzzword for marketing, it was a way of life. Your word was your bond, and your reputation was built not on what you owned, but on what you stood for. James's voice carried the weight of lived experience, each word resonating with hard-earned wisdom. Marcus found himself unconsciously straightening his posture as James spoke. "The Duke had a saying about boots," the older man continued. "He said a man's boots should tell his story. Not the story he wants people to hear, but the true story of where he's been and what he's done for others." These boots walked miles in service of others. James gestured toward the display. They carried their owner through movie sets, yes, but more importantly, they walked through moments of quiet courage and unsung kindness. The kind of moments that don't make headlines or trend on social media, but shape the world one small act at a time. The tech billionaire's entourage had drawn closer now, their devices forgotten, as James shared wisdom that no app could provide. "See, the value of these boots isn't in their craftsmanship or their celebrity connection, though both are significant. Their real worth lies in the principles they represent: hard work, integrity, service to others, and the understanding that true character is revealed in how you treat people when the cameras aren't rolling." James's voice took on a thoughtful tone. "I remember watching the Duke talk to a young extra who was having a rough day. He didn't just offer empty words of encouragement. He spent his lunch break listening to the boy's story, sharing his own experiences of struggle and perseverance. Those boots stood still for an hour while he helped someone find their way." The afternoon light caught the worn leather in the display case, highlighting every scuff and crack that James had explained. Each mark tells a story of choice, choosing to help when it wasn't convenient, to stand up when it wasn't easy, to give when others were taking. That's the kind of value that appreciates over time, that builds something lasting in a world obsessed with the temporary. Marcus's earlier mockery seemed distant now, almost childish in the face of such profound understanding. James continued, "These boots represent a time when success was measured not by what you accumulated, but by what you contributed, when influence wasn't about follower counts, but about the lives you touched and the examples you set." The Duke understood something fundamental. James's voice grew softer, drawing everyone closer. He knew that real power isn't in making people look up to you, but in lifting them up to stand beside you. These boots didn't just walk through scenes, they walked through lives, leaving footprints of kindness and courage that changed people's stories. The auction house remained hushed, the usual bustling atmosphere replaced by contemplative silence. "You know what the Duke would say about these boots today?" James asked, looking directly at Marcus. "He'd say they're not valuable because they're his. They're valuable because they represent something bigger than any one person. They stand for values that don't depreciate, principles that don't go out of style." James's hand finally dropped from the display case, but his presence remained commanding. In a world that's increasingly virtual, these boots are undeniably real. Every scuff mark is authentic, every wear pattern earned. They remind us that true character isn't carefully curated for social media. It's built through countless small choices to do what's right, even when it's hard. The tech billionaire's expensive watch caught the light, but somehow its gleam seemed less impressive now. James noticed but didn't comment, letting the contrast speak for itself. These boots, he concluded, aren't just relics of the past. They're reminders of timeless truths, that real wealth isn't in what we own, but in who we are and how we treat others. That's the kind of value that doesn't need an auction to prove its worth. Something shifted in Marcus's expression as he stared at the boots, his earlier smugness replaced by a distant look of recognition. His hand moved unconsciously to his pocket, where he kept a worn leather wallet, not his current sleek designer one, but his grandfather's old billfold that he'd carried through decades of hard work, building his small business from nothing. "My grandfather," Marcus began, his voice lacking its usual polished confidence. "He used to talk about John Wayne, used to tell me stories when I was young, before I got caught up in—" He gestured vaguely at his expensive suit and the tablets his assistants carried. "Before I started measuring everything by its market value." James remained silent, recognizing the moment when a man's heart begins to soften, when memories long buried under layers of acquired sophistication start to surface. The tech billionaire stepped closer to the display case, seeing beyond the worn leather to something deeper, something that echoed from his own past. "Grandpa had this pair of work boots," Marcus continued, his voice growing softer. "They looked a lot like these, worn, cracked, full of stories. I used to laugh at him for not buying new ones when he could afford them. He'd just smile and say, 'Some things get more valuable with wear, son.'" The last words caught in his throat, heavy with remembrance. The afternoon light shifted through the windows, casting long shadows across the auction house floor. Marcus reached out, his manicured fingers touching the glass, where moments before he had been pointing in mockery. "He passed away last year," he admitted, more to himself than to James. "Left me his boots. I kept them in their box. Thought they'd be worth something someday. Never understood what he meant about value until now." James nodded slowly, recognition flowing between the two men. "Your grandfather," he said gently. "He understood what the Duke understood, that the worth of a thing isn't in its shine, but in its service." The older man's words seemed to bridge decades, connecting the lessons of the past to the present moment. Marcus pulled out his phone again, but this time instead of composing a mocking post, he pulled up a photo, an old man in worn boots, standing proudly beside a young boy who would one day become a tech billionaire. "This was the last photo we took together," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He was wearing those same boots he'd had for 30 years. The crowd around them remained respectfully quiet, witnessing a transformation that went beyond the material to touch something fundamental about human nature. Marcus's entourage shifted uncomfortably, seeing their employer in a new light, watching as layers of carefully constructed sophistication peeled away to reveal something more authentic. "Grandpa used to say," Marcus continued, his eyes still fixed on the boots in the display case, "that you could tell a man's character by how he treated things that couldn't benefit him. I forgot that lesson somewhere along the way. Got caught up in the numbers, user engagement, market valuations, follower counts." James placed a weathered hand on the younger man's shoulder. "It's never too late to remember," he said quietly. "The Duke would say every day is a chance to start walking a better trail." The gesture, simple but profound, seemed to carry the weight of generations of wisdom. Marcus straightened up, squaring his shoulders not with his usual arrogance, but with a new kind of dignity. "These boots," he gestured to the display case, "they're not just movie props or collectibles, are they? They're a reminder of something we're losing, something my grandfather tried to teach me." The tech billionaire turned to face his assistants, who were still clutching their tablets and phones. With a gentle but firm gesture, he motioned for them to put the devices away. "Some things," he said, echoing words from his past, "can't be captured in a post or measured in likes." The transformation was subtle but undeniable. Marcus stood differently now, as if the weight of pretense had lifted from his shoulders. His eyes, usually calculating the next business opportunity, held a new kind of awareness, the recognition of value that couldn't be measured in digital metrics or market caps. As the afternoon light continued to play across the worn leather of John Wayne's boots, two men from very different worlds stood in understanding, bridged by the timeless lessons encoded in well-worn leather and lives of service. Marcus's realization wasn't just about boots or memories, it was about rediscovering a truth his grandfather had tried to teach him, that real value lies not in the price of things, but in the principles they represent. The auction room crackled with anticipation as potential buyers took their seats. Marcus, having shed his earlier arrogance, sat quietly in the front row, his phone turned off and tucked away in his pocket. A few seats down, James settled into his chair with the easy grace of someone comfortable in any setting, his weathered boots planted firmly on the polished floor. The auctioneer, a distinguished gentleman in his 60s, approached the podium with measured steps. The display case containing John Wayne's boots had been moved to a position of prominence beside him, the afternoon light still catching the worn leather in a way that seemed almost reverent. "Ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer began, his voice carrying years of experience, "we begin today with Lot 47, John Wayne's personal riding boots, worn throughout his career from 1957 to 1973. We'll start the bidding at $50,000. His gavel rested ready beside him, waiting to mark the moments to come. The first bid came quickly, a phone bidder from Texas offering the starting price. Marcus watched as numbered paddles began to rise throughout the room, each gesture pushing the price higher. 60,000, 75,000, 100,000. The numbers climbed steadily, but something had changed in how Marcus viewed the proceedings. Where earlier he had seen only an overpriced pair of old boots, he now recognized something more valuable. Each bid wasn't just an offer of money, it was a recognition of the history, the values, and the legacy these boots represented. His own paddle remained lowered, but his hand rested on it thoughtfully. 150,000, called out a collector from the back of the room. James sat motionless, his presence a quiet reminder of the stories he had shared. The boots gleamed in their case, each scuff and crack now telling a story to everyone present, thanks to his words. The bidding continued its upward climb. 200,000, 250,000. Museum representatives and private collectors traded increasingly larger numbers, each understanding that they were bidding on more than just leather and stitching. They were bidding on a piece of American history, on tangible proof that character and service still held value in a digital age. Marcus's hand tightened on his paddle. He glanced at James, seeing not the simple ranch hand he had first dismissed, but a keeper of wisdom that no algorithm could quantify. The auctioneer's voice rang out, $300,000. Do I hear 325? The tech billionaire's paddle rose slowly into the air. 500,000, he called out, his voice clear and determined. A murmur ran through the crowd. The amount was well above the expected range, but something in Marcus's bearing suggested this wasn't about money anymore. $500,000, the auctioneer repeated, his eyebrows raised slightly. Do I hear 525? The room fell silent, other bidders recognizing that something more than a simple auction was taking place. James turned slightly in his seat, studying Marcus's face. He saw there not the arrogant young man from earlier, but someone who had reconnected with forgotten values, someone who understood at last what his grandfather had tried to teach him about true worth. 500,000 going once, the auctioneer called, his gavel raised. Going twice. The moment stretched out, filled with possibility. Sold to the gentleman in the front row. The gavel fell with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through the auction house. As the crowd began to stir, preparing for the next lot, Marcus remained seated, his eyes fixed on the boots. The price he had paid was significant, but he understood now that their real value couldn't be measured in dollars. They were worth more, not because of who had worn them, but because of what they represented. James stood slowly, preparing to make his way out. His part in this story seemed complete, but Marcus's voice stopped him. Sir, the tech billionaire called quietly, would you wait a moment? There was something different in his tone now, a respect that hadn't been there before, a humility born of understanding. The auctioneer moved on to the next item, but few were paying attention. All eyes were on the unlikely pair, the young billionaire and the old ranch hand who had demonstrated that afternoon that some lessons can't be bought, only learned through wisdom shared and truth recognized. As the afternoon sun cast its final rays through the auction house windows, the boots gleamed in their case one last time before being carefully packed away. They had served their purpose, not just as historical artifacts, but as catalysts for a transformation that would ripple far beyond that day's events. The final bid had been recorded in the books, but the real transaction, the exchange of wisdom and understanding, had been priceless. After the auction concluded, Marcus approached James in the now emptying room. The boots, carefully wrapped in archival tissue paper, rested in a custom-made box on a nearby table, waiting to be transported to their new home. But Marcus had something else in mind, something that would have seemed impossible just hours before. "Mr. Cooper," he began, his voice carrying a newfound humility, "before you leave, I'd like to make you an offer." He gestured to the box containing the boots. "Not to sell them. I've learned enough today to know their value goes beyond any price tag, but I have a proposition about how they might best serve their purpose." James stood quietly, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, waiting for the younger man to continue. The last rays of sunlight filtered through the auction house windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Marcus's entourage had disappeared, leaving just the two men standing amid the empty chairs. "These boots," Marcus continued, "they belong somewhere they can continue telling their stories, not locked away in a private collection or displayed as a trophy of wealth." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I bought them because I finally understood what they represent. But understanding isn't enough. Action is what matters." James nodded slowly, recognition dawning in his eyes as he began to see where Marcus was heading. The tech billionaire pressed on. "I'm proposing we create something together. Not just a museum display, but a living legacy. A way to ensure these boots keep walking the path of service they were meant for." "What exactly did you have in mind, son?" James asked, though his slight smile suggested he already knew the answer would be worth hearing. Marcus's entire bearing had transformed from his earlier arrogant demeanor to something more genuine, more purposeful. "A traveling exhibition," Marcus explained, his excitement building. "Not just of the boots, but of the values they represent. We'll take them to schools, community centers, veterans' hospitals, places where their stories can inspire others to understand what real worth means." His hands moved animatedly as he spoke, painting a picture of possibility. "And who," James asked carefully, "would tell these stories?" Both men knew the answer, but the question needed to be asked, the invitation formally extended. Marcus met the older man's gaze directly. "I was hoping you would," he replied. "No one else knows these stories like you do. No one else can make them come alive the way you did today. I can provide the resources, the technology, the logistics, but the heart of this project needs to be the wisdom you carry." James contemplated the proposal, his eyes drifting to the box containing the boots. "It would mean traveling," he said thoughtfully. "Time away from the ranch. Lots of talking to strangers." But there was a spark in his eye that suggested these weren't objections, merely considerations. "We'll make it work around your schedule," Marcus assured him. "And we'll do it right. Not for social media attention or publicity, but for the right reasons. To share the kind of lessons I learned today, the kind my grandfather tried to teach me." The older man's face softened at the mention of Marcus's grandfather. "Your grandfather," he said quietly. "He'd be proud to see you understanding his lessons at last." The words carried weight, acknowledging the transformation they had both witnessed that afternoon. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Not to check messages or social media, but to show James the photo of himself with his grandfather again. "He knew what mattered," Marcus said softly. "Just like the Duke did. Just like you do. Help me share that wisdom with others." James extended his hand, rough with calluses from years of honest work. Marcus grasped it firmly, his own smooth palm meeting weathered skin in a handshake that bridged generations and values. "When do we start?" James asked simply. "Right away," Marcus replied, then caught himself with a small laugh. "That is, as soon as we plan it properly. Some things shouldn't be rushed." The lesson in patience, in doing things right rather than quickly, hadn't been lost on him. The auction house staff moved quietly around them, clearing away chairs and preparing for the next day's events. But in that moment, two men from vastly different worlds stood united in purpose, their unlikely partnership born from a pair of worn boots and the timeless values they represented. As they began to discuss the details of their collaboration, both men understood that this was more than just a business arrangement or a charitable project. It was a commitment to preserving and sharing something precious, the wisdom of the past, the importance of character, and the understanding that true value lies not in possessions, but in how we use them to serve others. 6 months later, John Wayne's boots stood in a specially designed traveling display case, surrounded by eager students at a small rural high school in Texas. But these weren't just boots behind glass anymore. They had become the centerpiece of something much larger, something that was changing lives across the country. James stood before the gathered students, his voice carrying the same power it had that day in the auction house. "These boots," he began, gesturing to the display, "walked through more than just movie sets. They walked through moments of courage, kindness, and service." Behind him, a large screen showed carefully restored photographs of John Wayne, each one telling its own story of character and commitment. Marcus sat quietly at the back of the auditorium, watching the presentation with quiet satisfaction. The Walking in Their Boots program, as they had named it, had already visited 20 schools, 5 veterans hospitals, and countless community centers. But this wasn't about numbers anymore. It was about impact, about passing on values that couldn't be measured in likes or shares. The tech billionaire had undergone his own transformation during these months. His designer suits had given way to more practical attire, and his once constant phone had learned to stay in his pocket during presentations. He had discovered that real influence wasn't about follower counts. It was about the lives you touched, the wisdom you shared. "Now, who can tell me what makes something valuable?" James asked the students. Hands shot up across the auditorium, eager to engage with the man who had become something of a legend in his own right. His stories, combining Hollywood history with timeless lessons about character and service, had a way of reaching young people that traditional teaching couldn't match. A young girl in the front row raised her hand. "Value isn't just about what something costs," she said confidently. "It's about what it means and what it can teach us." James smiled, nodding in approval. The lesson that had transformed Marcus that day in the auction house was now spreading, taking root in young minds across the country. The boots had become more than just a historical artifact. They were now a bridge between generations, a tangible link to values that seemed increasingly rare in the digital age. Each scuff and crack that James had described that day in the auction house had become part of a larger narrative about character, service, and the true meaning of success. After the presentation, students lined up to take a closer look at the boots, but more importantly, to talk with James. They shared their own stories of family heirlooms, of grandparents' wisdom, of things that held value beyond their price tag. Marcus watched from the sidelines, seeing his own transformation reflected in their eager faces. The tech billionaire's resources had made the program possible, but it was James's wisdom that gave it its heart. They had found a perfect balance, Marcus handling the logistics and infrastructure, James providing the soul and substance. Together, they had created something neither could have achieved alone. Local media had picked up the story, but not in the way Marcus would have once pursued. There were no carefully crafted press releases, no social media campaigns. Instead, the story spread organically, through word of mouth and genuine impact. Schools and communities reached out to them, drawn by the authenticity of their message. Between presentations, James and Marcus had developed an unlikely friendship. The older man had become a mentor of sorts, helping Marcus reconnect with the values his grandfather had tried to instill. In turn, Marcus had helped James reach a wider audience with his stories, ensuring that the wisdom of the past wouldn't be lost to time. The boots themselves had taken on a new life. No longer just memorabilia, they had become a symbol of something larger, a reminder that true worth isn't in what we own, but in how we live and what we give back. Each venue they visited added to their story, creating new chapters in a continuing legacy of service and character. As the students filed out of the auditorium that day, Marcus approached James. "You know," he said quietly, "my grandfather would have loved this. This is exactly what he meant about things getting more valuable with wear." James nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind the words. The Walking in Their Boots program had become more than either man had initially envisioned. It wasn't just about preserving history or sharing stories. It was about bridging the gap between generations, about keeping alive values that seemed in danger of being forgotten in an increasingly digital world. "Next week," Marcus said, checking his diary, "we're scheduled for a veterans hospital in Oklahoma." His voice carried anticipation rather than the weariness of travel. Every stop on their journey had become an opportunity to honor the legacy they carried and to pass it on to others. James smiled, his weathered face reflecting the satisfaction of a man who had found a new purpose in his later years. "The Boots," he said softly, "they're still walking their path of service, just in a different way now." And both men knew that somewhere the Duke would have approved. 1 year after the auction, the Walking in Their Boots program had touched more lives than either Marcus or James could have imagined. The story of the tech billionaire and the ranch hand who joined forces to preserve and share timeless values had spread far beyond their initial expectations, inspiring similar initiatives across the country. At a community center in Montana, a retired firefighter brought in his old helmet, sharing stories of service and sacrifice with local youth. In Florida, a grandmother's collection of handwritten recipes became the centerpiece of a program teaching young people about family, tradition, and the value of passing down wisdom through generations. Each new program traced its inspiration back to the unlikely partnership that began with a pair of worn leather boots. Marcus sat in his office, now decorated with photographs from their travels, not the carefully staged corporate shots he once favored, but genuine moments captured during their presentations. His grandfather's old boots, once kept in a box, now held a place of honor on his desk. Beside them sat a framed picture of that day in the auction house, the moment when everything changed. The program's impact was evident in the letters they received daily. A teenager in Ohio wrote about how the presentation had inspired him to spend more time with his aging grandfather, recording his stories before they were lost to time. A teacher in New Mexico shared how her students' attitudes toward history and values had transformed after experiencing the program. James's role had expanded beyond just telling stories. He had become a mentor to other speakers, teaching them how to connect with audiences, how to make history come alive through personal narratives. His approach, gentle, wise, and authentic, had created a template for others to follow while maintaining their own unique voices. The boots themselves had developed an almost mythical status. Their worn leather and weathered soles had become symbols of endurance, service, and the kind of success that couldn't be measured in dollars. Each venue they visited added new layers to their story, creating a living history that continued to grow and evolve. Local communities began developing their own programs, inspired by but not copying the original. In Seattle, a maritime museum started a Stories of the Sea program, using old navigation tools to teach young people about determination and finding their way in life. A small town in Georgia turned its local diner's collection of decades-old coffee cups into a storytelling initiative about community and connection. Marcus's transformation had caught the attention of other tech leaders. Some approached him about developing apps or platforms to share the program's message, but he gently declined. He had learned that some things couldn't be digitized, that real impact often came from face-to-face connections and shared experiences. The business world had noticed the change in him as well. His company's focus had shifted, incorporating values-based initiatives into its core mission. Employees spoke of a new culture, one that celebrated character and service alongside innovation and progress. The lessons learned from a pair of old boots had rippled through every aspect of his life and work. Schools began incorporating elements of the program into their curricula, recognizing that students needed more than just technical skills to succeed in life. The Boots story became a launching point for discussions about character, integrity, and the true meaning of success. Teachers reported increased engagement and deeper conversations about values and purpose. James, despite his initial hesitation about traveling, had found new energy in their mission. His ranch still got plenty of attention. He made sure of that, but he had discovered a broader purpose in sharing the wisdom he'd accumulated over his lifetime. His stories, once shared casually over fence repairs and cattle drives, now reached thousands. The media coverage had evolved too. Instead of focusing on the novelty of a tech billionaire and a ranch hand working together, reporters began exploring the deeper impact of their program. Stories emerged about families reconnecting, communities coming together, and young people finding new appreciation for the wisdom of their elders. At a recent presentation in Chicago, a young tech entrepreneur approached Marcus afterward. "I used to think success was all about disruption and innovation," he admitted, "but watching you and Mr. Cooper today, I realized there's more to it than that. Some things don't need to be disrupted. They need to be preserved and passed on." The Boots continued their journey, each mile adding to their legacy. But now, they weren't just John Wayne's boots. They had become vessels for a larger message about what truly matters in life. Their worth had transcended any auction price, becoming something that couldn't be measured in monetary terms. As Marcus reviewed the program's schedule for the coming months, he smiled at how far they'd come from that afternoon in the auction house. The Boots had taught him more than his grandfather's lessons. They had shown him a new way to measure success, impact, and value. In helping others understand these lessons, he had found something his wealth could never buy: purpose.